when we're talking about consciousness and cycles and changing mental states, sleep is one of the most universal and kind of easy to talk about changes in our consciousness. Like I said at the beginning, our sleep cycles show changes in consciousness, where we go from conscious and awake to unconscious and asleep every day, maybe multiple times a day if you like to have naps. And so these cycles can help us understand what's going on with our consciousness, at least in these situations. So when I talk about these cycles of asleep and awake, these have a technical name, and these are our circadian rhythms. So these are rhythmic daily cycles. And so we've been talking about the sort of awake to asleep and back again, or conscious to unconscious and back again. But these circadian rhythms actually influence more than just our consciousness. Our circadian rhythms also seem to influence our changing body temperatures. So for each of these graphs here, we have time along this axis, and it'll helpfully tell us if we should be awake or asleep. So these are 2 days, more or less, on this graph here, and it's showing us cycles in our body temperature. And so what this is showing is that when we're awake, our body temperature tends to be a little bit higher, and when we're asleep, our body temperature tends to be a little bit lower. And there's actually almost a full degree of fluctuation in terms of our body temperature based on our current state. And these are cyclical changes, meaning that they cycle. So they're going to repeat day after day after day. We also have changes in our melatonin levels. So just before we fall asleep, our melatonin levels start to rise, and melatonin helps regulate feeling sleepy and falling asleep. And before we wake up in the morning, those levels drop off again, and they stay low throughout the day. So those are going to show cycles. And even down here, this is a abstract measure of alertness, the idea that you are more awake and alert sort of middle of the day, and then less as you get closer to bedtime, and then you are very not alert at night. They don't tell us what their measure of alertness is here, but we can fill in the blanks with whatever we want. So our sleep cycle, these circadian rhythms, and specifically the sleep side of those circadian rhythms, is specifically regulated by a part of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. And so this SCN tells our pineal gland to release melatonin. So back here, where we're seeing this sudden rise in melatonin levels just before we go to bed, this this turning point where those levels start to rise, is where that suprachiasmatic nucleus has activated, where it has sent that message along to trigger the release of melatonin. So we can actually see what's going on there. And so melatonin is really important in helping regulate our biological clock. That's going to let us start the cycle to tell us to go to sleep. And melatonin is also involved in allowing us to wake up when its levels drop off again. And we don't have it on the slide here, but most of this is regulated by exposure to light. So first thing in the morning, when the sun is shining, you pull back your blinds. That exposure to bright light signals the start of your day. And then our biological clock will kind of keep time based on that exposure to bright light. The technical term is that you get entrained to that light. So when we have daylight savings time, we have to get up an hour earlier, then we are re-entraining to a new wake-up schedule. But exposure to light helps us keep time and know when it's time to wake up. Though we do get a little bit removed from that nowadays with our blackout curtains because we live so far north. But yeah, so light also plays a really big role, so that X amount of hours after that exposure to light, our SCN sends a signal to the pineal gland to release melatonin. And our internal biological clock keeps track of these things and allows us to maintain these cycles. That biological clock is also why we can still feel tired at night and alert in the morning, even if it's cloudy out. Or if we live in Edmonton, even if it's winter and we don't see the sun until 10 o'clock. So it's a complex system and a very cool one. But we're going to just stick to our high-level stuff here. So when we're regulating our sleep with our biological clocks maintaining that sleep cycle, normal people are going to require somewhere between 7 and 10 hours of sleep every day. Some of us are unlucky and need more hours of sleep a day, though some people end up being extra lucky, and they have a specific genetic mutation that means that they don't need as much sleep as the rest of us. So even this 7 hours is a normal person. If you have this mutation, you can get by with as few as 3 or 4 hours of sleep. So maybe you know that friend in university who could pull pretty much all-nighters every night to work on papers or get stuff done, and it didn't seem to bother them. They might be able to do that because of a mutation that lets them do that. For the rest of us, if we pulled a lot of all-nighters, if we had a lot of very short sleeps, we'd end up with sleep deprivation. So if we miss that required amount of restful sleep, it's called sleep deprivation. And if you are sleep deprived for long enough, if that amount of lost sleep accumulates, you can end up with a sleep debt. This is why during midterm season or final season, when you're staying up late and only sleeping 5 or 6 hours a night, when you get to the end, you're exhausted. Maybe you're going to sleep for 12 hours that first night. And that extra sleep that you need is because you've built up a sleep debt. You need more sleep to compensate for all the sleep that you've missed. Now, in the next couple of slides, we're going to start talking about our different stages of sleep. So the same way that we are cycling from conscious to unconscious and back again, when we're sleeping, we're also going to keep seeing these cycles. So every 90 minutes or so, we're going to cycle through our stages of sleep. And so I want to start by pointing out this little graphic at the bottom here. And so these are going to show us which stage we're talking about, plus the corresponding EEG activity. So an exemplar of what our brain activity looks like for each particular stage. And so if you remember, looking at EEG data, this axis, this up and down, is going to be our amplitude. So how much energy is being measured. And along the bottom axis, that's going to be time. So over time, how many neurons are firing and what patterns of firing are we seeing? So before we start with stage 1 sleep, I actually want to start with talking about what's going on when we're awake. What happens when we're not asleep? And so for the parts of our brain that aren't actively involved in another process, that aren't thinking about something or doing something, your brain sort of idles with these beta waves. And our beta waves are going to be pretty low amplitude, but very high frequency. So the peaks are very small, but they're pretty close together. And so this is what our brain looks like overall when we're awake and alert, but not really doing anything. Now, once we start to get sleepy, as we relax and become drowsy, we're going to transition from our beta waves into what are called alpha waves. Now, if you know how the Greek alphabet works. It might seem weird that beta is coming first here, but these terms were named in order of discovery and not in order that we see them happening. So, in an ideal world, alpha would come first, but you have to remember that here beta comes first, then alpha, and then theta, just to make it complicated. But these alpha waves, these are going to have a higher amplitude and a little bit of a lower frequency. They're not very slow, they're still pretty quick. We're still seeing a rapid up and down here, but the dimensions, the amount they're going up and down is higher, and they're doing it a little bit less quickly. So our alpha waves are a little bit higher amplitude and lower frequency than beta waves. So these start appearing, our alpha waves start appearing as we get tired and as we get ready to fall asleep. Which brings us into stage 1, which is also called light sleep. And this stage is going to happen sort of as we're just falling asleep. So this is our transition from being awake but drowsy to falling asleep. And this cycle, or this stage of the cycle, doesn't last very long, usually a minute up to 10 minutes. So it's going to be pretty quick. And so we have kind of this mix of alpha and beta waves as we're getting ready to fall asleep, and they transition into theta waves, these ones over here, which are more high amplitude and even lower frequency than the alpha waves. So as we fall asleep, we get higher amplitude and lower frequency waves. Our brain waves are sort of slowing down here. And during this stage, if you've ever started drifting off and maybe you have a flash of you're falling off of something and you jump, you have a jerking feeling. That is called a hypnic or myoclonic jerk. And you can have hypnagogic imagery that goes along with it. And this is the fancy way of saying that sometimes when you're falling asleep, you fall asleep so quickly that your brain thinks you're dying, and it sends a jolt to jerk you awake to make sure that you're still alive. So that twitch of the leg, or the feeling that you were falling off of something and you were going to hit the ground, that's part of this stage 1 sleep, and it's specifically called hypnagogic imagery and your hypnic or myoclonic jerks. Now, stage 2 is aptly named, I guess I'm trying to think of the right word for this. It's logically named deeper sleep. So this is the progression from light sleep to slightly deeper sleep. And stage 2 is going to last a little bit longer, usually between 10 and 25 minutes. And we're seeing this continuing pattern of decelerating brain waves. So our brain waves are slower, they're lower frequency. And along with that slowing of our brain waves, we're also seeing that our heart rate slows. Our body temperature starts to drop. So we're seeing that pattern from our circadian rhythms. Our muscles start to relax and our eye movements cease. We're going to start seeing in this stage sleep spindles. So sleep spindles are these weird little bursts of high activity. So as you can see here, everything around our sleep spindles is pretty high amplitude and low frequency. So nice and slow and relaxing brain waves. But our sleep spindles are very jagged and very close together. So they're very high frequency in between all of these lower frequency brain waves. So we can identify them by that change in frequency. And these last for a second or two, and then you go back to your normal theta waves. But there are periods of high activity. For stage 3 and 4, we're going to lump them together. And these are our deepest stages of sleep. And for stage 3, we start seeing delta waves, which are very, very slow, very low frequency waves that are very, very high amplitude. And so they start to appear in stage 3, and by the time we hit stage 4, all we're seeing are these delta waves. And both of these stages are associated with restful sleep. So you have to make it to stage 3 and or stage 4 sleep to wake up feeling rested and refreshed. And then after stage 4, something unexpected happens. So even though we've had this pattern of higher amplitude, lower frequency waves, going higher amplitude and lower frequency, when we hit the next stage, REM sleep, all of a sudden our brain waves look very, very similar to what they looked like when we were awake. So we're seeing pretty much beta waves here. And so REM sleep, or stage 5 sleep, is going to occupy about a quarter of our night's sleep. And once we hit REM sleep, it can last for 20 minutes or it can last for an entire hour. This one has a lot of variability. And we can actually look at how all of these stages come together. So I wasn't able to put them all on one slide at the beginning because I needed my text. But here you can actually compare the difference between awake and alert brain waves and our REM sleep brain waves. And they look fairly similar. And everything else kind of follows that predictable pattern of gradually getting slower. So that's kind of weird. What's going on? Before we get into what's happening, I want to talk about how these all fit together. So even though we talk about stage 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then REM, in actuality, our sleep cycles look just a little bit different from that. And our cycles change over the course of the night. So as the night goes on, we will have less and less of our deeper sleeps and more of our REM sleep. So stage 4 and stage 3 will be very common and happen for long periods of time at the beginning of the night, but once you've had enough restful sleep, you don't go as deep of sleeping and you'll spend more time in REM. And I have a visual that will help us conceptualize that. So this at the bottom is our time variable. So hours of sleep. So how long have you been asleep? And this is just meant to be a average overall representation. We don't have to follow this exactly, but it's a pretty good representation. And here on the side, we have our different stages of sleep, as well as some indicators for dream activity and our eye movements. And so we'll start by looking at these where dreams are happening all the time. So even though we have this misconception that dreaming only happens during REM sleep, that's not the case. We can wake people up when they're in stage 2 sleep and they can report having had a dream. So dreams happen through all stages of sleep. And then for our eye movements, these seem to be restricted pretty much to REM sleep, which I didn't say it at the time, but REM stands for rapid eye movement. So this is the only stage of sleeping where our eyes are moving actively and rapidly, which is why it got its name. So from there, let's actually look at what we're talking about at the top here. So what stages are we seeing and when? So when we start off at the beginning of the night, you've started to fall asleep, you're getting sleepy, you're relaxed, you're drowsy, and then you can drop into stage 1 sleep. And as we said, you don't spend a whole lot of time in stage 1. It's a very quick process as you transition over into sleeping. From stage 1, you'll drop to stage 2, you'll spend some time there, then you drop down to stage 3, spend a little bit of time there, and then you drop down to your first stage 4 sleep of the night. And at the beginning of the night, you're going to spend a lot of time in these deep sleep stages. So you spend almost an hour maybe in stage 4 sleep, or whatever this works out to on their axis here. But once you've hit the end of that period, you cycle back up through the stages. So stage 4 was as deep of a sleep as you had. You'll come back up to stage 3, then stage 2, and then instead of returning to a light sleep, you're going to enter your first REM cycle of the night. And so unlike stage 4 that starts with the longest stage 4 sleep of the night, for REM sleep, you tend to start with your shortest REM cycle, so instead of the longest. So you'll spend maybe 10 minutes in REM sleep, and then the cycle starts over again. So you'll go from REM down to stage 2, down to stage 3, and then all the way down to stage 4. But this time, the amount of time you spend at stage 4 sleep is less. Maybe your body has started to feel rested, maybe you're recovering, but you don't have to spend all that much more time in stage 4 sleep. So after 20 minutes, you come back to stage 3, then 2, and back up to REM. And this time you spend longer in REM because you spent less time in stage 4. And then this time, because you had enough stage 4 sleep last time, you only go down to stage 2 and then to 3, and then you come back up again. So we skipped stage 4 entirely because you got enough deep sleep earlier in the night. So back up to your longest REM cycle so far. And then this time when you drop down, your body is okay. It's recovered enough. You don't need even stage 3 sleep. So you go down to stage 2 and then back to REM again. And we're spending more time in REM sleep. And then this is showing that our cycle gets disrupted as we come out of sleep and wake up the next morning. So this pattern of less and less deep sleep as the night goes on, and more REM sleep as the night goes on, is our ideal sleep pattern. It doesn't always work that way, though. So before I start talking about weird things that interrupt our sleep, we can first start talking about dreaming, because dreaming is one of those things that everybody seems to do, and we don't really know why. So dreaming is a pretty much universal experience. Even people who have been blind since birth seem to dream. And we even have some evidence for consistent types of dreams across cultures. So embarrassing moments in front of your friends might be something that everyone experiences, no matter what culture they're from. So that consistencies across multiple cultures that have different social influences tells us there might be something genetic about dreaming, and specifically about what we're dreaming and maybe how. But we don't have a whole lot of answers. We'd all love to know why we dream, and there are some theories. Maybe our dreams are helping us process emotional memories. Maybe we're working through our emotions. Maybe dreams are a way of learning new things, so working out new strategies or problem solving. Have you ever gone to sleep? You've been trying to write an essay and you can't come up with the right way to word your statement, so you've gone to sleep and you'll just deal with it tomorrow, and you wake up the next morning and you know exactly how you want to say the thing you're trying to say. You solved it in your sleep. Maybe that's why we dream. And so, of course, we can talk about Freud and his ideas of dreaming. And Freud had this idea of a dream projection or protection theory. So he talked about our dreams as our guardians of sleep. So Freud has his idea of our ego, the mental sensor, our protector, the part of us that keeps us from doing something that is not socially acceptable. That ego, that mental sensor, is less able to censor our actions when we're asleep. So when it's inactivated during sleep, These sexual and aggressive instincts that we're constantly pushing away when we're awake, the things that we're constantly repressing, are suddenly allowed to bubble to the surface. And so our dreams take the place of our ego, and they work to disguise and contain and subdue those weird sexual and aggressive urges and impulses. So they're going to turn them into symbols, things that we wish we could do if our ego and society wasn't keeping us repressed from doing them. So he has this idea that our dreams are a way that we can fulfill our wishes, the things that we want to be able to do, but aren't physically capable of doing. And if you're thinking that that is a very strange interpretation, that is how most psychologists view this theory. There are very, very few people who still have any support for this theory. But again, as with most of Freud's theories, he got people thinking about dreams and what else might be going on. So our next theory is the activation synthesis theory. And this is pretty much the opposite side of the spectrum from our dream protection theory. This is the idea that our dreams are just brain activation that's happening while we're asleep. So it's not some deep repressed desire, it's not wish fulfillment, it's not anything. In fact, it's the random firing of the neurons in our brain. So the idea is that our neurotransmitters in the brain are going to be shifting. So when we're asleep, when we're resting and recovering and recuperating, we have this weird pattern of activation and depression or inactivation across our brain. And this pattern isn't meant to be any particular thought process. It's not serving a purpose. It's just helping us to reset and rest and recover. And that rebalancing leads to this haphazard and chaotic or random pattern of neural firing. And so because our mind, it has the job of interpreting things. So our forebrain spends all of our waking hours making sense of the thoughts that we're thinking. Then while we're asleep, it's still making sense of these signals it's receiving, but the signals don't have a purpose. They're random and chaotic. They're not coming from something. They're just happening by way of our brains resetting. And so our forebrain does the best it can to make sense of random information that in fact doesn't mean anything. And this randomness and this attempted translation helps explain why dreams are strange and disordered, why we feel so weird, and why dreams don't progress normally. Of course, we really don't know if that's the case. Our brains do fire and have activation while we're asleep, but we lack the ability to subjectively describe what we're seeing at the time that we're seeing it because we're asleep. So what else could it be? Well, there are some cognitive theories, kind of like what we already talked about. There are some problem-solving dream models where our dreams allow us to play out possible solutions to a problem without the restrictions of reality. So we don't have to worry about making a mistake in the real world if we can play out the scenario in our heads. Maybe we can come up with creative solutions because we're not being held back by our own mental processes. We also have some cognitive process dream theories. And these are basically just saying that our brains keep doing what they do while we're awake when we're asleep. So you keep working through things that you were working through while awake. Those mental frameworks, those ongoing processes just keep happening. And so, of course, we really don't have a concrete explanation. These are all proposed ideas of what might be going on, but none of them are completely right. though some are more wrong than others. So for our next section, we want to talk about what abnormal sleep looks like. So if we've talked about normal sleep patterns and what our brains do normally, what happens abnormally? So the first of our sleep disorders is insomnia. And insomnia is the most common sleep disorder there is. About 10 to 40% of the population has insomnia or will have insomnia at some point in their lives. And insomnia is a chronic difficulty in falling asleep, staying asleep, or experiencing restful sleep. And this is a common misconception. People assume that insomnia is only a difficulty falling asleep. But if you have insomnia, you might fall asleep at 9 o'clock every night, no problem. But you're up 2 hours later because you won't stay asleep. That is still insomnia. You can have someone who has insomnia, who sleeps the whole night through, but if they wake up feeling exhausted every night, it can still be insomnia. So this is a little bit more complex than what we think of it being. There's also a weird case of pseudo-insomniacs. So these are people who talk about how they can never sleep. They have terrible insomnia. They're up all the night. They can't stay asleep. They wake up and they're exhausted. Everything is awful. But if they go to a sleep clinic where they actually measure your brain waves and they watch when you fall asleep and when you wake up, these pseudo-insomniacs have completely normal brain activity. They fall asleep at a normal time, they enter those deep stages of sleep just fine, and they wake up the next morning, but they still report insomnia. And that might just be that in their minds they think they have it, so they're manifesting it, or maybe there's something else going on that's preventing them from experiencing a restful sleep, but at this point in time, we don't know what it is that's doing it. Our next type of sleep disorder is actually the opposite problem of insomnia, and this is narcolepsy. And people who are narcoleptic experience episodes of sudden sleep. So they can go from being fully conscious and engaged to immediately dropping into REM sleep. And sometimes, in an inconvenient association, people with narcolepsy will also have cataplexy. And cataplexy is a complete loss of muscle tone. Now, in normal cases, when you fall asleep, pretty much everyone experiences cataplexy because it helps us not act out our dreams. If you've ever had to share a bed with a sibling and they're kicking you in the middle of the night, then their shutting off of muscle tone didn't work and they're acting out their dreams, potentially. So usually, cataplexy and disconnecting our brains from our motor neurons helps us to sleep restfully without acting out our dreams. But if you are standing and walking and having a conversation and all of a sudden you enter REM sleep and you lose all muscle tone, people are going to hit the ground. So a lot of people who have narcolepsy suffer a lot of injuries because they fall down whenever it happens. And getting narcolepsy can be something that's genetic. It could be caused by particular types of brain damage, or there are rare cases where a severe lack of certain neurotransmitters can trigger it as well. And interestingly, there are species, because there are genetic factors involved in narcolepsy, there are species that have populations that are narcoleptic. So maybe you've seen YouTube videos of narcoleptic goats. Those are populations of goats that have genetic predisposition towards narcolepsy. There are universities where labs are studying narcolepsy, where they've bred populations of narcoleptic dogs. And so this is possible because there is a genetic component to it. Our next couple of disorders we're going to go through just quickly because we don't have tons of time for each of them. The first is sleep apnea. And an apnea is basically a blockage of your airway. And so if you have sleep apnea, while you're sleeping, your airway gets obstructed. And instead of staying asleep and having a restful sleep, all of a sudden you're unable to breathe. And this is especially troublesome because the deeper you're sleeping, the more at risk you are for blocking your airway. Now, it's very rarely fatal, as far as we can tell, but it does tend to rouse people from deeper sleeps. So if you have sleep apnea, whenever you enter stage 3 sleep, your air supply might get cut off, and that prevents you from reaching stage 3 and stage 4 sleep, which would allow you to rest and recover every night. And these apneas can happen hundreds or even thousands of times a night, so you can imagine how exhausting this can be. For our next category of sleep disorders, we can have REM sleep behavior disorders. And this is going to be a broader category of times when that muscle paralysis doesn't happen. So when we talked about our cataplexy, where your muscle tone goes away, in REM sleep, you are supposed to have muscle paralysis. But people with this REM sleep behavior disorder, they don't have that paralysis. So they can talk and move and act out their dreams all while sleeping. And this seems to be caused by brain abnormalities, but it's not well understood. Now, closely related to that, we have our sleepwalkers. And these are just episodes where people walk and interact with their world while asleep. And this one is pretty common too. It's a lot more common in children, where 15 to 30% of children will sleepwalk, but only 4 to 5% of adults sleepwalk. And they don't always sleepwalk. A sleepwalker isn't guaranteed to sleepwalk every single night. It's usually an occasional thing. And the people who are prone to sleepwalking are more likely to do it when they're extra tired, so when they've been sleep deprived. So it's an interesting occurrence. And because it's more common in children and less common in adults, the accepted quote-unquote treatment for sleepwalking is to wait for people to grow out of it. For our last sleep disorder, we can talk about night terrors. And so we all have an idea of what a nightmare is, where you wake up and you've had a bad dream and you feel sort of startled and scared, but you can reassure yourself it was just a dream and maybe you'll go back to sleep. A night terror is like a nightmare but on steroids. So people who wake from night terrors usually wake up screaming. They're usually sweating profusely, they're confused, they're disoriented, they don't know what's going on, and they will almost immediately return to a deep sleep. So they don't, calm themselves down and slowly get back to sleep. They're immediately going to drop back into one of those deeper levels of sleep. And these episodes, these terrors, last for just a few minutes and then they go back to normal. And again, we don't really know what's going on. So I'm sure you can get a trend here for sleep and dreaming and disorders. Our brains are very complicated and we don't have a fantastic understanding of what's going on where it comes to sleep.